The following video contains spoilers for all 6 seasons of The Sopranos, all 6 seasons of BoJack Horseman, Over the Garden Wall, all 4 seasons of Infinity Train, Quantum Flight 888, Black Mirror, White Christmas, and Hellraiser, Hellseeker. I will be using spoilery clips from, but not discussing, Attack on Titan, Game of Thrones, Lost, Ghost Story, Sherlock, Saw 1 through 8, Loki, as well as several other films and novels I don't feel the need to mention because they're at least 80 years old. And a little caveat before we begin. I'll be using footage from a variety of TV shows and movies that fit into our theme. However, not all of these scenes are technically examples of my thesis. I'm planning on releasing a few short videos in the future discussing examples I show but don't talk about in this video, and whether or not they really count. Consider this. Our intrepid hero has apparently been killed, the screen has cut to black, and all hope seems lost. Naturally, the hero wakes up shortly after, clearly not dead, but as they look around in confusion, they realize all is not as it seems. The world around them is recognizable, similar to their childhood home or the battlefield where they were mortally wounded, or a totally new yet somehow familiar fantasy world, but everything is just slightly off. There's a blurriness to their senses. The landscape around them changes by itself. They are continuously confronted by NPCs whose faces feel terribly familiar. Our intrepid hero isn't dead. Not completely. They have entered a new world, fully real in a metaphysical sense, and fully meta in a real physical sense. A thematic simulacrum of their own universe, similar in every sense other than the audience's concern for their physical well-being. While they're dying of a stab wound, or drowning in a pool, or contemplating suicide over a rushing river, our hero has, at the same moment, arrived at the last chance of their psyche. The phrase last chance at the psyche was coined by, well, me. My 2017 psychological horror novel, Quantum Flight 888, introduces the phrase in reference to a trope that I by no means created. The last chance of the psyche has been in use for decades, if not centuries, albeit unnamed, by storytellers from all different mediums and genres. In the universe of Quantum Flight 888, the last chance of the psyche is a theoretical concept that is known and disputed, if not widely, in the academic world. This is contrary to real life, in which the last chance of the psyche has never been believed to actually occur, aside from the alleged pre-death flashback, and merely refers to a storytelling trope that has been widely used but rarely discussed. The instance of the last chance appearing in Quantum Flight 888 was written to be the most archetypical form of the trope, hitting all the major beats. In fact, it would be the perfect example to use in this video, except that I don't want to spoil my own book. In short, the last chance of the psyche occurs when a fictional character experiences an extended sequence set in a world similar but not identical to their own. A dream, for instance, or a supernatural vision, for the purpose of accepting hard-hitting truths or growing as a person, usually in a very specific way. Sometimes it is the character's rapid growth or an emotional epiphany that allows them to leave this alternate world and return to their own life. Sometimes they are at the mercy of the fantasy world or the laws of nature, and have no control over the length of their stay or whether they can ever leave at all. Despite the foreboding name that I came up with, threat of immediate death is not integral to the last chance trope. The character just needs to be in a transitional period, at a crossroads in their existence or emotional journey, in which they are rapidly heading into the less favorable option and need to undergo some serious introspection to remind themselves which is preferable. The last chance trope is similar to the way purgatory is represented in media, an alternate world that can truthfully be referred to as real, though it exists on a totally different plane of reality than the protagonist's home. Most famously in Dante's Divine Comedy, Purgatorio is depicted as a 10-tiered mountain one must climb following their death and preceding their acceptance into heaven. In modern times, cautiously agnostic stories such as Harry Potter, Coco, and multiple episodes of The Twilight Zone have depicted the Christian middle world in their own artistically diverse ways. But the last chance of the psyche differs from purgatory in several ways. First and foremost, that a massive number of people actually believe in purgatory. Although this transitory world is never mentioned in the Bible, the concept of a world of purification to be visited between earth and heaven is so common in oral tradition that it transcends Christianity. Although not exactly the same concept, Judaism, Islam, and several other religions include traditions of a minor afterlife in which one atones for their sins. On a more superficial note, depictions versions of Last Chance fantasy worlds take more diverse forms than the usual dim and dismal purgatory. While purgatory as a concept can be taken in many different literary directions, the versatility of the Last Chance and its total lack of rules allows this trope to be called upon in infinitely more scenarios. Another difference is that purgatory, by definition, can only be visited after death, with the exception of Dante, obviously, while the fantasy world of the Last Chance can only be visited while still alive, though usually just before death. If purgatory exists to allow the visitor to atone for their sins and move on to heaven, the Last Chance exists to allow the visitor to atone for their sins and move on with their lives in a more honest and morally upstanding way. In film and literature, purgatory often serves a similar role to the Last Chance of the Psyche, but by definition, they can never overlap. In fact, Dante's Purgatorio is not so different from the Last Chance trope. Unlike the interpretation of purgatory more common to his time, Dante wrote this afterlife to be a world in which the dead actively improve on their morality, becoming closer to God and atoning for their past mistakes, rather than simply accepting harsh punishments for their crimes. Dante established the modern interpretation of purgatory, separate from that of hell not only in its liminality, but in its purpose and treatment of its occupants. At the same time, he paved the way for one of the most overused but rarely talked about tropes in literary history. The Last Chance of the Psyche has been used in many different situations and taken many different forms over the years, from light-hearted magical worlds to dark and hellish dream sequences inspired by the protagonist's faltering mental state. Probably the most common form of the Last Chance is a dream or fantasy sequence under threat of death or a continued coma. In the physically real world the audience has come to know, our protagonist is shot or stabbed or otherwise mortally wounded, rendering them catatonic and, to those around them, unresponsive. But thanks to some glossed over activity in their gray matter, their synapses begin firing at full speed, and their brain stimulates their senses to create a fantasy sequence that feels to them more physically real than any ordinary dream. This is no simple life flashing before their eyes. Their mind has created this fantasy world because their subconscious knows the only way to keep moving forward is to finally accept whatever darkness they're holding on to. The conquering of their fantasy world, almost beating it like a video game, can sometimes mean the difference between life and death for our protagonists, depending on what horrors await them back in the physical world. One of the most recent high-profile examples of the Last Chance of the Psyche, and one that hits almost every beat of my thesis, is the penultimate episode of Netflix's black comedy BoJack Horseman. Titled The View from Halfway Down, this episode sees protagonist BoJack attending a dinner party with his parents, along with all the other characters who have died throughout the series. No context is given after the events of the previous episode, but the presence of dead characters is a pretty big indicator that all is not right. Throughout the episode, BoJack and his dead friends discuss the nature of life, death, happiness, morality, and a number of other topics that seem tangentially connected to BoJack's character arc. BoJack reveals that this is a recurring dream he's experienced many times, but is thrown off guard when the dream doesn't end. It is revealed that BoJack is in fact drowning in his pool, and that this dinner party is the last chance for his psyche to make peace with itself, before giving in to brain damage and death. At one point, the dinner transitions into a talent show scene, in which the characters perform acts that reflect their lives and deaths, specifically tailored to BoJack's situation. The character of Secretariat, based on the real-life racehorse depicted in BoJack as a celebrity athlete who committed suicide after a betting scandal, praises the concept of suicide, encouraging BoJack to end his miserable life on his own terms. However, in one of the most heart-wrenching TV moments in recent memory, Secretariat reads a poem titled The View from Halfway Down, recounting his final thoughts in the moments after he jumped off the bridge, realizing only now, in limbo, that he desperately wanted to live. Unlike certain other Last Chance sequences, The View from Halfway Down displays a hauntingly cynical outlook. Whether or not BoJack accepts his death or believes his life had any meaning, there is no escaping his fate. He isn't trapped in a dubiously supernatural coma, like say, the characters in the final act of Quantum Flight 888, no spoilers, and he isn't about to simply wake up in bed to discover it was all a dream. He is all alone, drowning in a pool, and can't even open his eyes, let alone save himself. The View from Halfway Down is a pitch-perfect example of the Last Chance of the Psyche trope. From the familiar setting, BoJack's childhood home mixed with the set of his breakout TV series, to the appearance of familiar characters from the protagonist's life, to the ultimate revelation that this is not any sort of afterlife or even a supernaturally inspired vision. The entire episode takes place within BoJack's oxygen-deprived brain, and as one of the characters puts it, it's just, quote, your brain going through what it feels like it has to go through. This is a simple and concise description of the trope at large, and one of the only moments I've come across in which a last chance NPC actually refers to the nature of their world. Although the vague understanding of the last chance trope holds that the protagonist can save their own life by accepting their shortcomings and changing as a person, this is rarely the case. In non-supernatural media like BoJack Horseman, there is nothing the dreamer can do within their fantasy world that will affect their catatonic, alcohol-poisoned body as it drowns in chlorinated water. As previously mentioned, the version of the last chance trope I employed in Quantum Flight 888 does in fact give the characters some control over their own deaths, provided they can accept whatever has held them back for the length of the novel, but Quantum Flight 888 is set in an explicitly supernatural world, and the characters find themselves forced into their fantasy worlds by supernatural means. Another example of a non-supernatural, coma-induced last chance occurs in Season 6 of The Sopranos. After being shot by his senile uncle, Tony Soprano finds himself dubiously conscious in a new city, lacking his mafia ties and Jersey accent. Tony's last chance takes up the bulk of 2 episodes, as he wanders around a very grounded fantasy world and ponders on the nature of identity and religion. Unlike BoJack, Tony is laying comfortably in a hospital bed, surrounded by friends and family. Although he is comatose, they are able to subtly interact with him and even invade his fantasy world, as when the doctor's LED overhead appears to dream Tony as a helicopter searchlight. Surprisingly, given the usual ambiguous tone of The Sopranos, Tony's last chance arc culminates in a blatantly symbolic scene in which Tony meets the first external character to appear in his fantasy world, his cousin, Tony Blundetto, who Tony earlier murdered, who beckons him to enter a well-lit house. Standing in the glowing doorway is a figure who looks very much like Tony's dead mother. Given the villainous nature of the late Livia Soprano, one is left wondering if the house actually symbolizes hell rather than heaven. Personally, I would argue neither. I always interpreted the glowing door as representing death, regardless of an afterlife. Given that Tony is comatose, but not in immediate threat of death like BoJack, the implication seems to be that Tony actually has been granted the non-supernatural ability to choose whether or not to die, through the overclocked power of the subconscious. He eventually chooses not to enter the house, partially thanks to his daughter's voice filtering in from the real world and begging him to stay with her, and partially thanks to his all-too-symbolic briefcase, which Tony B insists he can't take with him. Tony Soprano still has work to be done before he moves on. Season 6 wasn't the first time The Sopranos delved into the last chance trope. The 11th episode of Season 5, titled The Test Dream, is filled out by a lengthy dream sequence populated by important figures in Tony's life, both living and dead, as well as subtle and overt symbolism to his current state and his character arc up till now. At this point, Tony is barreling towards the moment when he will be forced to murder his cousin, Tony B, but he isn't set on this decision. The confusing direction and symbolism of his dream appear to guide him into a choice, though his mentality after waking up is ambiguous. The test dream represents another variation on the last chance trope, ordinary dreams in which the dreamer's life is not in danger. The stakes are generally much lower with these sequences. In less cynical and less realistic media than The Sopranos, these dreams often guide the protagonist into realizing their faults and growing as a person. Ordinary dream last chances are common in more simplistic media that does not contain supernatural elements or the regular threat of death. Possibly the most famous last chance of the Psyche ever written falls into this category, that being the 1939 film The Wizard of Oz. Although Dorothy is knocked unconscious during a violent tornado that threatens her life, it is made clear after she wakes up that the storm never actually posed any threat and that she was simply sleeping off her light injury this whole time. To make a simple movie complicated, the purpose of Dorothy's subconscious in creating an imaginary world that stimulated all her senses into believing it existed physically was to help her realize what she refused to accept. That there's no place like home, and that her aunt and uncle are more important than relieving her boredom. Unlike the test dream, Dorothy's adventure in Oz has a semi-grounded atmosphere, if not in the set pieces, then in the character interactions and linear narrative. This is the major suspension of disbelief that must be taken by the audience for most last chances to make sense. That in an imaginary world, be it a dream or a coma or a near-death experience, the protagonist is acting like a rational human being, and not like the bumbling mess of an NPC we usually are in our dreams. But this concept isn't so unbelievable. The dialogue and actions in our dreams may be simpler than in reality, but in our dumbed-down subconscious state, we are more than capable of understanding the scenarios presented in these imaginary worlds. Like BoJack and The Sopranos, The Wizard of Oz includes characters from Dorothy's real life within her fantasy world. However, they play different roles, and Dorothy doesn't recognize their identical faces until after she wakes up, which, to the film's credit, gives the entire concept a more dreamlike quality. That being said, one could argue that if The Wizard of Oz was really all a dream, then it was mighty convenient that Dorothy happened to wake up naturally right as she clicked her heels 3 times. A counterpoint to that would be that Dorothy's subconscious retains control over her own consciousness, similar to Tony Soprano's. Another counterpoint would be that it's a kids' movie from 1939, so maybe don't try to poke holes in it. Although The Wizard of Oz was explicitly no more than a dream, certain other last chance sequences are more ambiguous with the line between supernatural and subconscious. For instance, the only last chance of the psyche that may be better known than The Wizard of Oz, Charles Dickens' A Christmas Carol. The fact that Ebenezer Scrooge is jump-scared by Jacob Marley on his walk home, and isn't seen to fall asleep before Marley appears in his full spectral form, seems to imply that Scrooge is seeing Marley and the other spirits while he is wide awake. However, when Scrooge begs the ghost of Christmas yet to come for mercy and clutches to his robe, he suddenly finds himself waking up in his own bed, his hands wrapped in his sheets. Whether or not Scrooge physically flew and time-traveled in Dickens' 1843 novella is totally irrelevant when discussing A Christmas Carol for its merits as a work of fiction, and for our purposes, we can mark it down to a simple dream last chance with heavily implied external supernatural forces, at least more heavily implied than in The Wizard of Oz. The important takeaway for our purposes, similar to children who hear the story of A Christmas Carol for the first time, is that Scrooge changed as a man. Over the course of one night, he learned to shed his cold-hearted, miserly ways and give of himself generously. If The View from Halfway Down is the perfect example of the last chance of the psyche's mechanics, A Christmas Carol is the epitome of the last chance of the psyche's heart. The story may be simple, and Scrooge's development may come a little quicker than seems natural, but without the cynicism and moral ambiguity of the 21st century, A Christmas Carol perfectly exemplifies all that is supposed to occur when a character undergoes the last chance of the psyche. While The Wizard of Oz and, depending on interpretation, A Christmas Carol gave us last chance sequences that appeared supernatural but were in fact simple human dreams, examples can also be found of the opposite, supernatural last chance sequences that appear to be dreams. For instance, Cartoon Network's Over the Garden Wall depicts a pair of brothers, the first characters in this video to share a last chance, in the process of drowning, transported to a fantasy world where they learn to overcome their emotional hangups and grow as people before waking up back in the pond and rescuing themselves. Although this may seem like a full dream akin to The Wizard of Oz, a brief shot at the end of the final episode confirms that the boys' fantasy world did exist in some physical capacity, even though they never left the pond, and the show's closing montage catches up with minor characters from the other world, confirming that they continue to exist whether or not the Earth boys are present. Our first fully supernatural, unambiguous last chance at the psyche is another Christmas staple, Frank Capra's 1946 classic It's a Wonderful Life. The film of course follows George Bailey, a man on the verge of suicide even after a life well lived, and his guardian angel Clarence, who descends from heaven to show George a world in which he was never born. One could easily argue that Clarence is imaginary, that everything between the two bridge scenes is some kind of desperate attempt at self-preservation by George's subconscious, except for the plain fact that the first 2 acts of the movie are narrated by Clarence and another celestial entity, unseen but clearly very real beings of the Christian angel variety. George's Last Chance of the Psyche takes a unique form, not a fantastical world that vaguely resembles his own, populated by familiar faces who don't quite seem to recognize him, but a very grounded Back to the Future Part 2 style alternate timeline in which George never existed and the town of Bedford Falls is rife with sin and debauchery. George is privileged among the ranks of characters who have gone through the Last Chance of the Psyche. He is fully awake, fully conscious of what's happening, and he is allowed to decide on his own that he will not go through with suicide, that he will never see the view from halfway down. All supernatural elements and dream sequences aside, there is a third major type of last chance stories, the fully manufactured ones. The most literal of these is Cartoon Network's Infinity Train, an anthology series that ran for 4 seasons and centered around the titular Endless Train, whose cars are bigger on the inside and feature fantastical worlds of totally different genres and themes. Although the series ended before any backstory could be given on the train or its creation, its purpose was defined early on, to take normal people with emotional baggage and put them in life or death situations, where they would be forced to overcome whatever holds them back. Unlike your archetypical last chance, say The View from Halfway Down, the characters of Infinity Train are not trapped within dying bodies. They physically exist within the train, and their time aboard has no effect on their lifetime. However, the train is populated by immensely dangerous adversaries, so it is possible to be killed, not by one's own failure to complete their arc, but by a literal NPC within the last chance world. Infinity Train is such a perfect example of the last chance trope that its characters even bear number tattoos that count down as they come closer to reaching the ends of their character arcs. I may be describing the setup to sound like a lazy vehicle for character development, but Infinity Train was far from that. Along with being a near perfect example of a manufactured last chance, it was also a well-written, engaging, and shockingly mature show that was taken out long before its time. One could argue that the series of traps depicted in the Saw movies could be considered a last chance of the psyche, though this may be stretching it a bit. There are no dreams, supernatural forces, or even drugs bringing John Kramer's twisted traps into existence. However, Kramer has always stated that his goal is not to kill, but to force his victims to appreciate their lives which they have usually tossed away. Kramer's motivation aligns with the unspoken goals of the subconscious in more traditional last chance sequences, but the subconscious is finally allowed to speak, and it speaks through a doll on a tricycle. Another form of manufactured last chance occurs when the protagonist has taken some sort of drug, usually ambiguous in purpose and potency, and either falls asleep to dream vividly or stays awake to hallucinate. To use a very simple example, in The Simpsons movie, when Homer has been abandoned by his family due to his selfishness, he is guided by a stereotypical Inuit woman who gives him an ambiguous hallucinogenic. Because he exists inside a lighthearted comedy, Homer's last chance functions exactly as intended. He trips heavily until he explicitly states the purpose of his character arc and then is allowed to return to reality. Unfortunately, most of the characters in this video are not from lighthearted comedies, and their trips to their last chance fantasy worlds didn't always end as easily. The Last Chance of the Psyche has been a staple of fiction for quite some time, albeit unnamed, but is it even a useful trope, or is it just a lazy way of forcing character development? Well, like all tropes and all writing conventions, this depends on how it's used. The success or failure of a last chance sequence can be greatly affected by the structure and pacing of the story around it. Sometimes, the last chance sequence takes up the bulk of the story. For instance, A Christmas Carol, in which we are introduced to Scrooge as a cold and spiteful miser, and barely have a chance to connect with him before we are whisked away to explore his emotionally turbulent past. In Hellraiser, Hellseeker, the protagonist lives through increasingly unrealistic scenarios before discovering that he has been simultaneously trapped in hell and trapped in a dying body, while certain visual cues from reality filter into his fantasy world. Not technically a last chance of the psyche, but this serves my point. Side note, if you happen to be a Hellraiser fan, I'm going to be reviewing all the Hellraiser movies on my other channel, Nathaniel J. Nelson. The first one is going to be out shortly. Loath as I am to say anything positive about a Hellraiser movie after the fourth one, Hellseeker manages to trick its audience into sympathizing with the protagonist, even if he is clearly immoral and unlikable, before revealing the scope of his past misdeeds and showing us that he truly deserves to be in hell. Similarly, Black Mirror's special episode White Christmas follows innocent-looking Joe, a man hung up on past mistakes. Given how we come to know and like Joe, the audience can't imagine that his sins could be particularly heinous. But when it is revealed that the two central characters are trapped within a digital simulation in which time passes incredibly slowly, Joe admits to his friend that he murdered his elderly father-in-law, which resulted in his stepdaughter freezing to death. If the story had begun with the revelation of Joe's crime, his final acceptance of guilt wouldn't have struck the audience as hard. He would have been telling us what we already know, and we would have no sympathy. Similarly, if Hellseeker had shown us from the beginning that our protagonist had been cheating on his wife, the beloved final girl from the original film, and even attempted to sacrifice her to the Cenobites, the audience would have felt more satisfied than horrified to realize that he is in hell. This point of structure is where our two Christmas classics differ. A Christmas Carol would not have worked if Dickens had laid out Scrooge's entire life in the first two acts, then crammed all his development in the last few pages and forced the reader to sit through Scrooge's backstory twice. However, It's a Wonderful Life is almost entirely taken up with George's backstory, from his childhood at the chemist's to his adulthood at the bank to the night he contemplates ending it all. Only the third act sees George undergoing the last chance of his psyche, the difference being that, unlike Scrooge, George doesn't revisit all the important moments in his life, and the audience isn't forced to rewatch what they've already seen. Clarence presents George with an alternate world populated by darker versions of places and characters we've already come to know, none of which would make sense if we hadn't dedicated an hour and a half to exploring Bedford Falls. And unlike the methodical and contemplative ghosts of Christmas past, present, and yet to come, Futzy Clarence and Manic George aren't about to pause and discuss the backstory behind every person and building in Pottersville. All plot structure aside, it wouldn't be difficult to argue that The Last Chance of the Psyche is a lazy trope whose only purpose is to shoehorn in the character development you've forgotten to sprinkle throughout your story. On a certain level, the concept seems to perfectly contradict the old Hollywood mantra of show, don't tell. Creating an imaginary world that centers entirely on our protagonist and their emotional arc feels like the definition of telling. Like the writer brushed up against their word limit and realized they'd barely started writing. On the other hand, forcing one's characters to directly confront their emotional or spiritual hangups can make for some heart-wrenching moments. Who could forget when Ebenezer Scrooge sees his own name on the future headstone, or when Wirt finally accepts Greg as his real brother? And the laziness argument is only valid if the trope is used with no depth. Dorothy woke up from her dream with a new appreciation for her home and family, but is it ever implied that she will never talk back or even try to run away again? Much like the physical harm caused by John Kramer, the emotional drain of going through a last chance of the psyche is enough to make anyone appreciate their life with new eyes, even if it doesn't mean they'll suddenly become a faultless angel. And all emotions aside, the events of the last chance sequence don't always create a positive change in the character's life. Tony Soprano was able to wake himself from his coma by refusing to enter the house, but he's still trapped in a violent lifestyle on which he is emotionally dependent. After deciding not to kill himself, George Bailey is still wanted for grand larceny and would have gone to jail if not for the townspeople's donations. And BoJack Horseman may have accepted his death and coincidentally been saved from drowning, but he ends up in jail, without a village full of happy townsfolk to lend him a meager 1940s sum. Like any trope, The Last Chance of the Psyche is a tool, and only ever as good as its user. As my historian and novelist father often says, in writing, you can make anything work, as long as you can make it work. One could argue against any benefits of The Last Chance of the Psyche in literature, but could they argue against the endurance of The Wizard of Oz, or the haunting tragedy of The View from Halfway Down? A trope is a trope is a trope. And The Last Chance of the Psyche is a trope that has been used countless times, sometimes very well, sometimes very poorly, always in a unique way. So far, I've addressed The Last Chance of the Psyche as a trope of fiction, a method of storytelling with no bearing on reality. As I mentioned earlier, within the world of Quantum Flight 888, The Last Chance of the Psyche is a theory posited by academics who recognize that they could never prove that it really happens. This was all made up for the novel, but there is some basis in truth. The age-old trope of one's life, quote, flashing before their eyes during a near-death experience, or directly before their actual death, has long been believed to really occur, at least in a certain sense, though this is nearly impossible to prove or even study scientifically. However, this may have recently changed. A 2022 study hosted by Frontiers in Neuroscience involved scanning the brain of an 87-year-old man in his final living moments, having been rushed to the ER after falling off a ladder. A decompressive craniotomy was performed on the man, allowing doctors to remove the hematoma that had formed due to cranial trauma. The man lived for another 2 days, albeit catatonic, during which several burst suppression patterns and 12 individual electrographic seizures were visible in his electroencephalographic readings. The man was allowed to pass away after his DNR was confirmed by family, but his EEG readings speak volumes. According to the study, the readings showed, quote, an increase of absolute power in gamma activity in the narrow and broad bands, and that a, quote, decrease in theta power is seen after suppression of bilateral hemispheric responses. Essentially, the man's brain underwent an extended period of powerful electrical surges, despite no brain activity being detected. This study presents the unnamed man's EEG readings as potential evidence for the existence of the legendary pre-death flashback, not just as a trope of fiction anymore, but possibly a hidden feature of our all-too-complicated human brains. But could this gamma activity be more than just a visual flashback? Could the man's 5 senses have been stimulated, allowing him to relive his past in an interactive way? The truth is, we'll probably never know. The study concludes that though, quote, the brain may pass through a series of stereotyped activity patterns during death, the scientists involved were not likely to get another shot at scanning the brain of a man in the same situation, and that, quote, gathering such data from healthy subjects is impossible by definition. The idea of a real-life pre-death flashback doesn't seem like too much of a stretch, but The Last Chance of the Psyche? Well, until some peer-reviewed evidence is presented, that's just fiction. At least, in the literal sense. People on death's door may not be given ultimate control over their bodily functions by the all-powerful subconscious, provided they accept whatever is still nagging at them about their past. Dreams are never as complex or meaningful as Dorothy's, and thankfully, there are no real infinity trains or jigsaw killers to snatch us up and violently force us to confront our demons. But that doesn't mean The Last Chance of the Psyche can't apply to every one of us, even those with little chance of accidental death. Isn't that the core philosophy of both Jigsaw and whoever built the Infinity Train? Those characters may be sadistic, but they weren't exactly wrong. Too many of us wallow in regret, letting our lives slip by, wishing we'd done things differently, taken a different job, ended a relationship earlier, tried to take advantage of what little time we have, instead of wasting it on meaningless pastimes. We don't have to be forced into self-reflection by other people or our own rebellious subconscious. And when we do consider our lot in life, it wouldn't hurt to think outside the box, to wonder what we're doing, or not doing, that we may desperately regret in the future, and how to change that path. Take a second to think about it. Just imagine for a moment that The Last Chance of the Psyche is more than just a silly writing trope. If you somehow ended up in a fantasy world populated with the people you've loved and lost, what might that look like? What epiphanies or realizations would you have to accomplish in order to come to the conclusion that some people never really attain? That your life is worth living, and living to the fullest? Would you try your hardest to accomplish these goals, knowing they're a microcosm of the emotional turmoil that none of us can escape alone? Or would you just give up and decide that it's not worth the effort? What would you do if you only had one last chance? Well, this is my first full-length video after hitting 1,000 subs and being monetized, and I'm just so utterly thankful for all your likes and subscriptions, and especially your comments, especially on the Bionicle video. If you're still watching, well, thanks again. I hope you liked this one, and I hope it didn't come off as an advertisement for my book, because it definitely was not supposed to be that. But this is an advertisement for my book, so if you happen to be looking for something new to read, Quantum Flight 888 and Arrowgrendel are available on Amazon in multiple formats, with some free chapters on my website and my other channel, Nathaniel J. Nelson. I also have a bunch of short stories available on my website to read or to listen to, narrated by either myself or one of the amazing horror narrators on YouTube. My website is natnelson.com because Nathaniel and Nate were already taken. If you guys can think of any examples of The Last Chance of the Psyche, drop them in the comments below. I'd love to hear from you. And if you have any video suggestions, send them my way.